Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. The chandelier threw an aquarium of light across Leonard's marble floor, each crystal catching the room like a constellation. Anna Martinez kept her back to the gloss and moved between tables the way a shadow moves along a wall, swift, practiced, careful not to be seen. Her apron was new this week. Her hands, the same hands that once traced equations across a whiteboard, had learned instead the economy of plates and the quiet language of refilling bread baskets. When she reached the table by the window, she bowed slightly, a motion of service more habit than humility, and took the woman's order. Mrs. Blackwood sat nearest the glass, hands folded in her lap. She wore a cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Her eyes followed Anna with an attention that was more seeing than most. Anna answered Mrs. Blackwood's questions in small motions, fingers finding the shapes the older woman used to talk. Short, exact signs that flickered between them like a private light. It was a small thing, a human seam, changeable and soft. When Anna slid a cloth over the rim of Mrs. Blackwood's water glass, the older woman caught her wrist and signed a single, careful word. If there was a music in that touch, Anna kept its tempo in her chest and tried to ignore everything else. The hum of conversation, the scrape of chairs, the distant thump of a subway car under the street. She was careful. That was how she had survived the years since her name stopped appearing where it should, on patents and press releases and the company rosters that once read her as a technical founder, then read her out like an awkward erratum. A woman at the next table laughed, bright, manufactured, and the laugh was the color of cheap champagne. She wore a dress the hotel concierge would have called bold, and a ring heavy enough to make glass flirt with its weight. She leaned over, voice carrying, and made the kind of joke that landed like a stone on the glass between Anna and the room. "What's this city coming to?" she said, eyes sliding over Anna's plain apron. "Everyone's an expert now, especially on things they can't afford." Anna felt the joke hit her shoulder before she realized she had heard it. She kept her expression blank, a skill from years of hiding. Mrs. Blackwood's hand tightened around her fingers. The woman with the ring gestured and, with the casual cruelty of someone able to buy consequences, tipped her wine glass. Red flared, an accidental geometrical bloom across the linen. Anna moved to the spill, napkin pressed to cloth, breath steady. The woman laughed again, not because her glass had broken, because she had made the spill happen. Seconds later, she regretted everything. It happened faster than a thought. Marcus Blackwood, tall, deliberate, a person who looked like the world had folded to make room for his shoulders, stood from the table with a movement that filled the restaurant's polite chaos with insistence. For an instant, Anna thought, "He is here," and something in the way his mouth tightened told her that whatever his power, it would not cushion the woman's malice. Marcus did not shout. He crossed the space between their tables with the quiet speed of someone who'd learned to carry consequence. He paused, glanced at the woman with the ring, then looked down at Anna. His eyes flicked to her hands as she pressed a napkin to her skirt, hands that trembled a fraction, then steadied. He saw, or pretended to, the faint scar along her wrist where a paper cut had mapped a year of late nights. For reasons Anna could not fathom yet, he smiled and said to his dining companion, You should apologize." The woman's smile, brittle overhead lighting, fell away like a mask. She blinked, flush rising from collarbone to cheek. Around them, heads turned. An audience assembled by reputation and the restaurant's polite curiosity. Sex and money and a single careless action had built a moment that, in the span of a breath, Marcus made into shame. Anna had learned the economy of remorse. It usually arrived too late and could not be cashed. But this was not that kind of remorse. Marcus lifted his chin and then, with the kind of casual authority that converted attention into action, invited Anna to sit. "Come over," he said. "Please join us. The wine will be fine. We'll have another bottle." The hostess's hand hovered between gesture and obedience. That was when the woman with the ring, Jennifer, Anna's ear caught the sound of the name, a name like a label, reached for a napkin, and then, as if to substantiate the humiliation she'd caused, whispered something that might have been a joke, or an attempt at a joke, about the kinds of people who worked invisible jobs. The word she used was small and brutal. Andrew, someone at the same table, laughed, as if to confirm that humiliation was entertainment. Marcus did not let the laughter stand. He had the flat, quick way of someone used to shutting down markets or opening boardrooms. "Anna," he said, in a tone that made the whole table pivot, "this is my mother. And you," he turned to the woman who had poured wine, "you can do better than that." The waitress a few tables over breathed out as if to admit relief. Anna's heart drummed a careful rhythm, one learned in late lights under poor fluorescent light, learning to measure breath in order to sing silent. Mrs. Blackwood signed something to Marcus, an urging, a detail of thanks. He translated it aloud for the table, a practiced interpreter. "She says she likes the bread here best." So the woman who mocked her sat, red spreading across the linen like a map of her own arrogance, while Marcus, who Anna had seen in a photograph once, in a headline about a corporate benefactor, a man whose name was used as a geographic marker in the city's money, made visible what this dining room had missed. Anna felt the change as if someone had turned the light toward her. Where before she had been part of the background, she was now a subject to be observed. When the check came, Marcus left a card with an arrangement, the kind of arrangement that would have paid for the woman's evening and perhaps given the staff a bonus. But his last gesture was for Anna. "If you're free tomorrow," he said, as if offering a schedule. He closed the cup of the sentence with an invitation that felt like more than a job. "There's someone I want you to meet." Her first instinct was to refuse. She had refused before. People offered rescue like a corseted dress, beautiful and constricting, a garment to be worn only at the cost of some part of oneself. Anna had learned to hide the lines beneath the surface. She had learned, too, how dangerously attractive the offer of being seen could be. She accepted because the old part of her, the one that had starved so long for recognition that she had once cried on a subway platform reading the patent numbers she had discovered in an email, accepted with the same desperation as someone reaching for a life preserver. After she clocked out and folded her apron with hands that smelled faintly of lemon oil and the restaurant's red wine, Anna returned to the narrow apartment in Queens that let in the city's breath and kept out its face. The studio was a patchwork of thrift store furniture and one disciplined corner, a small desk, a laptop that had once been state-of-the-art, a shelf of notebooks where diagrams had been redrawn until the ink faded. She locked the door and, for a moment, let herself breathe, as if each exhale was a measure of small forgiveness. Her phone buzzed, Marcus's number, precise and impersonal. She read the message once, twice. "Breakfast at 9? There's something about you I need to know. M." The message was simple and dangerous. It opened a door into a life she had learned to keep closed, where her name had once meant something that she had been taught to believe would protect her. She thought of the papers that used to bear her signature, the months when her email had been the axis around conference calls rotated. Then she slid into the quiet of her memory. Meetings with David Chen, his easy charm, the way he wrote figures on napkins and made them look like prophecy, the late dinner where he praised her algorithm and then, a month later, called it our work in a press release and put it on a slide with his name above it. There were things she did not tell anyone anymore. The night she watched her name disappear from a filing by a court clerk who did not ask why. The month when everything unpaid piled up like newspapers at her door. She learned the vocabulary of survival, supply runs, small shifts, a life that had been ground down into necessary choreographies. But she had also kept the notebooks, the hard copies of drafts, the emails printed and folded, because she did not trust the cloud that had once been used to gaslight her out of a company. Marcus came to the breakfast with a coat that smelled faintly of teak and the river, an umbrella under his arm, even though the sky was mercifully clean. He was less show than the photographs implied, a man accustomed to presence but not to indulging it. He regarded her with a propriety that did not hide curiosity. Then, after a beat where both had measured each other, he spoke plainly. "I found traces of your work," he said, not as an accusation, but as an offering. "In filings we were reviewing. Some of the timestamps didn't make sense. We're doing due diligence for a deal. There's a merger David Chen has proposed." He let the name rest between them. The name was a cold thing. "We thought maybe there had been an invisible contributor. Your handwriting was on one of the patent cover sheets." Anna's first reaction was to deny, old reflex. She knew the economy of admitting things and how quickly admission could be used to manipulate. But the face in front of her was not the face of someone who would gloat. Marcus's fingers drummed on the table, a quick, controlled pattern that suggested impatience mixed with moral weight. He had the look of someone raised to the mechanics of power, who nonetheless believed power should be bent toward rightness. "You had a partner," Anna said finally. Not quite a question, because the memory of David took up space like a shadow under a door. Marcus nodded. "He's at the center of the deal. We can map transactions. But if your work is part of that intellectual property, it changes valuation. It changes liability. It changes people's livelihoods, including yours." She wanted to laugh then, bitter, because his vow of concern read like a civic poem, but she did not. Instead, she laid out a small history in restrained terms. Graphs, drafts, the meeting notes where she had agreed to a collaboration that had turned into an erasure. Marcus listened the way a good lawyer listens to a witness, gathering, silent, attentive enough to form strategy from sorrow. "And you kept the files?" he said at last, as if the fact of their existence were a proof of stubbornness and hope. Yes. She felt the words small and large at the same time. She had kept them because memory was a physical thing in her hands, notebooks, scraps of print, a few emails. They were not dramatic to anyone who did not know what to look for, metadata, drafts, timestamps. But to someone who understood the provenance of ideas, the papers were a vein of gold. Marcus's jaw softened at the edges. "I have people who can do that kind of work. Carefully, legally. We'll build a chain of custody. But I need to know if you want this." There it was, the choice she had avoided for months, then years. Stay small and safe and invisible, or step back into a world that would dress her bruises in press jackets and conference rooms. The risk tasted metallic, not afraid exactly, but keen, like the first breath after a dive. Anna thought of Mrs. Blackwood's hands and the small language she'd used to thank Anna for a bread roll. She thought of the way the wealthy woman had laughed and then quickly dissolved into apology when Marcus had fixed the spotlight. The memory of humiliation had been a soft bell in her chest for so long that the idea of ringing it again felt frightening. But there was also a muscle that remembered the day she'd stayed up until dawn to test an algorithm, the way variables had finally clicked into a pattern so clean that she had cried with the newness of the idea. "I don't want to be invisible anymore," she said. Marcus leaned back, then forward, then slid his phone across the table with a simplicity that erased flavored gestures. The screen showed a single email prompt: "Secure line, legal team on standby." "Good," he said. "We start tomorrow. But I need you to understand something else. If we go after someone like David Chen, he will not play fair. He is resources. He is slippery. He is dangerous in the way rich men are dangerous. He will weaponize process and public opinion. That means we proceed carefully." She nodded. She had no illusions. She had learned the vocabulary of predators: charm, meticulousness, plausible deniability. There was a moment where she imagined David reading the news about a breakfast and smiling the kind of smile that meant someone else would suffer expenses. The story of her life, she knew, had long been lined with those smiles. When she left Marcus's building that morning, an envelope had been slid under her apartment door. It contained a short note in a hand that was not Marcus's, but his assistant's, and a printout with a number circled in red, a patent filing date that matched one of her notebooks. Someone had been meticulous enough to find what she'd tucked away. The number was a proof of something she hadn't dared say out loud in years: that she had been right. Over the next days, the work moved into rhythms Anna had only imagined. Marcus's team did not arrive as a cavalry, but as a methodical tide. There were interviews with lawyers who used phrases like chain of custody and non-disclosure agreements, meetings where evidence was catalogued with the sterile tenderness of museum conservators. Marcus was present in the margins. He offered coffee, an occasional steadying smile, and never once did he make the effort sound like charity. He positioned it like a correction to an error, and in that framing there was a dignity Anna had not felt in a long while. David Chen did not appear at first. Instead, there were coordinate moves that smelled of money, the quiet resignations of minor players, a paragraph of a press release, the subtle erasure of Anna's name from a public record. He had the sort of visibility that cast shadows rather than light, a presence that suggested influence underground. He was a man who learned to let others speak for him and to keep the hands that did his dirty work polished and out of sight. There were small victories that tasted like salt: a clerk admitting they had misplaced a document, a metadata stamp that proved a file had been uploaded before a press release went live. Each proof stitched a thin seam into the ragged hole where Anna's reputation had been pulled out. Her joy each night was a combustible thing, fragile and private. She would trace her fingers over a printout and memorize the angles of her own handwriting, as if the shapes of the letters were the vessels that would finally carry her back into being. The restaurant remained an axis. Anna returned sometimes to the Legnard, this time not to clear tables, but to sit in the evening where she could observe the city like a patient. Mrs. Blackwood waved when she saw her. Anna would cross and sign a thank you. And sometimes they would sit and share bread like a small conspiracy against loneliness. The hands motif the DNA insisted on, soft gestures, the thumb on cheek, the way trust could be made plain by a simple hold, became a private language between them. Anna felt safer when she could show her hands and have them recognized for what they could do. The more research Marcus's team did, the more Anna learned that erasure was a construction built by people who understood how to rewrite paper into a narrative that read like inevitability. David had the ruthless patience of a man who could sit in a room and wait, moving pawns until the board read what he wanted. He had, somewhere in the knot of his empire, people who could clean traces. But Marcus's due diligence was not theatrical. It began at the edges and worked inwards like a tide. They pulled archive emails, found an offhand reply that matched a phrase Anna used in 20 different drafts, discovered a timestamp on an old drive that could not be faked without leaving a digital scar. Each discovery tightened their case. There were other players. Sarah, a junior associate on Marcus's team with quick hands and a nickname that meant she was a predator in the good way of investigators. Charles Morrison, an older litigator whose face had the long wear of someone whose profession meant living in courtroom storm seasons. Jennifer, the woman from the restaurant, slid into their periphery as an embarrassed satellite, contacting the restaurant to apologize, then awkwardly offering statements that read like attempts at repairing something she had broken by accident. Jennifer's path crossed Anna's again with the same small clumsiness that wealth can produce, and Anna learned to accept such minor apologies without yielding to the hunger for vengeance. David's first move, when it came, was not a fist, but a legalese bloom, letters from lawyers, warnings about defamation, and a thinly veiled suggestion that pursuing the matter would be costly. He had, it was clear, in the stones he threw, a legal team practiced at making legitimate grievances feel illegitimate. He was always the sort of man who could rely on procedure to look like righteousness. On a late afternoon when rain flattened the city into a sheet of gray, Anna sat in Marcus's office, his midtown tower a glass spine reflected in the slickness outside, and watched him as he explained a strategy with a clarity that made her trust him more than any polite promise. There were parts of the strategy she did not understand, and Marcus was careful not to condescend. He showed her a timeline, fingers tracing the dates that had once been a smeared mess and were now a map. "We won't rush it into the press," he said. "We'll build the documentary chain first, originals, witnesses, backups. Once we have a critical mass of proof, we'll let the law and the market do the rest. Publicity is a tool, but it's also a weapon. We'll decide when to use it." Anna felt in that moment the old pulse of belonging to a project that had meaning beyond survival. It was the kind of work that made sense of long nights and small sacrifices. She felt something wary and hopeful at once. Her hands were on the table, palms flat, and Marcus watched them the way someone might watch a small, powerful animal, respectful, slightly in awe. It would not be simple. That was the gritty truth they both knew. David had friends who could manufacture modest counter-narratives. He could turn an honest line into a smear if given enough oxygen and enough hired voices. But they had one thing he did not, an original provenance. They had draft notes with her handwriting, timestamps from devices only she had used, a witness who had seen her in the room when an idea was born. Small things that, strung together, formed a rope. They presented evidence. A set of emails, printed originals flagged, screenshots of cloud saves with timestamps. A witness declaration from a contractor who'd overheard a specific phrase only Anna used. The documentation moved through the room with an almost affectionate precision. Anna watched each page pass like a child watching a treasured object being recognized. The chain of evidence was not glamorous, no dramatic confession, no last-minute walk-ins, but it bent the weight of the world toward fact. When they were done, Marcus looked at her with an expression that had both fatigue and resolve. If David objects, he'll try to bury this with attorneys and press releases. If he disappears behind lawyers, we'll have to be willing to pursue it for as long as it takes. Are you ready for that? She nodded. The choice was made again. Each time it would be made. Anna had wanted her name to matter, not for spectacle, but because she wanted the work she had done to mean something in the world. She thought of the algorithm as a child she had raised through code and hunger. To have it forgotten was to kill what she had brought into being. She was ready, because what was the alternative? To return to invisibility? To watch other people profit from her labor while she learned to count coins? Was an abyss she would not let swallow her again. Outside, a black car passed and threw a sheet of rainwater along the sidewalk. In its reflection, Anna saw herself, small and necessary, a refracted version of what she desired to be. None of them had expected that their quiet work would draw attention in the form it eventually did. An executive luncheon punctured by social media rumor, a whisper that turned into a headline. David, when told that due diligence had found anomalies, responded with a smooth video statement about reassessing corporate narratives. It was the public face of his movement, calm, reasonable, free of the guilt that characterized men like him. The real fight would be less photogenic. File requests, subpoenas, the work of litigators who ground truth down to paper. And yet, in the edges, life continued in brutal smallness. The woman who had poured wine on Anna, Jennifer, found herself facing awkward glances that widened when the press asked why she had been at the table with a man connected to the merger. People could forgive ignorance more easily than cruelty, but small humiliations had a way of curdling into reputation notes that traveled faster than any public relations statement. Anna walked into Lanchlard one evening to the sound of the host's voice calling her name. The staff moved around her with a new respect that was not quite right. The city's hunger for narrative remorses had given them reason to be kinder. Mrs. Blackwood tapped her glass and signed a small phrase, "Be careful," then smiled. Anna's hands felt heavy and electric. She thought of the chain of custody they had compiled, the legal team that had filed papers that morning, and the forthcoming confrontation that would come in the sterile light of a conference room. She also thought of Marcus, not as a savior, she would never frame it that way, but as a man who had seen her hands and chosen to make them visible. The thought was both terrifying and bright. There were strands of attraction there, threaded through shared purpose, attraction that felt like a risk and a promise. When the night came that would pivot their arc, a moment that would require Anna to stand and declare what a room had forgotten, she found herself in a boardroom with the city skyline a fractured mural outside the glass. David's lawyers were properly polished, his voice measured, and his smile like a coin minted to look human. He glanced at Anna with a grin that suggested he believed himself untouchable. He had rehearsed the right tones for every danger, and for a long time those tones had shielded men like him. Marcus placed the last packet of evidence on the table, the slow, neat sheet of proof that linked drafts to her account, a witness deposition, a time-stamped drive. There was no fanfare. To anyone who watched the minute mechanics of legal fights, this was ordinary, slow accrual of proof until the weight was enough to move a mountain. But to Anna, it felt like the exacting, peculiar geometry of reclamation. She stood up. The room's temperature narrowed. Her hands, those hands that had once devised an algorithm, folded around a single copy of a printed draft. For a moment, she thought of the restaurant's chandelier, the way light had once made her invisible into something visible. She thought of the smell of the bread she and Mrs. Blackwood shared. She thought of the way the woman's laugh had become the kindling for a bigger story. She began to speak. Her voice did not tremble the first sentence or the second. She spoke with an economy of detail that edged each fact toward inevitability. The room listened, as rooms do when a person is saying not only what happened, but why it mattered. She spoke of nights of code, of meetings where ideas had been praised and then folded into someone else's biography. She read aloud phrases from her notebooks and compared them to phrases in the company documents. The effect was a simple arithmetic. Provenance plus proof equals truth. David's lawyer rose and made the professional protests the law required. He called process and offered denials that were air-thin. But the chain Marcus had built did not rely on confessions. It relied on documents and witnesses. When the boardroom reporter finally left, the echo of Anna's voice hung in the glass like a proposition the city had been invited to consider. Afterwards, in the fragmented quiet, the woman who poured wine, Jennifer, approached Anna. Her eyes had that apologetic wetness people display at funerals of etiquette. She offered a small, halting apology for the restaurant incident, and Anna accepted. There was no satisfaction in the exchange that tasted of pettiness. It felt like the extinguishing of an ember that might otherwise have flamed. What Anna wanted was not spectacle. She wanted restitution, not merely in money, but in the recognition of a work's origin. If the law could not make that right, then perhaps the world's record could be corrected enough that future creators would not be swallowed by erasure. The legal processes moved as slowly and as inexorably as glaciers. There were papers and hearings and moments of almost hope where they seemed too close, and then setbacks where they realized how well David's apparatus had been built. He filed countersuits and hired public relations firms whose job was to turn attention into sympathy for him. In press photographs, he looked as if he were the victim of a smear campaign, an artisan of his own fabrication. Yet, for every legal gambit he played, Marcus and Anna had a counter, documents, a witness, the simple fact that the city tends to remember original hands. The arc of their work was not a cinematic exposure with a last-second confession, but a slow, methodical correction. Those were the kinds of victories that leave the body tired and the mind clear. The triumph was not sudden, it was edible, like bread after hunger. In the end, when the day's litany of filings had settled, and a judge found enough probable cause to issue a warrant and to open a criminal inquiry into the manipulation of corporate filings, Anna felt a relief that was not triumphant so much as suited to the moment. She had reclaimed a part of herself that had been appropriated. The news showed photos of David being led from a building in handcuffs. He had the same composed face, the same practiced disbelief. The cameras offered his confusion and then moved on. The woman who had poured wine did not appear in the footage again. She had perhaps learned a lesson in humility. She had been visible for only a moment, and that moment had turned the wheel of her own reputation. For a long time, Anna thought about the exactness of that second, the arrogance, the splash, and the sudden inversion where the woman found herself shamed in the spotlight that had once been turned away from Anna. After the legal dust had settled into a settled pattern, David convicted on charges related to falsifying corporate documents and intellectual property theft, settlements completed, Anna's name restored to filings and press releases, the city seemed larger and stranger. She was no longer simply a woman with a past. She was a person whose work was acknowledged in public records and who had an unexpected partner in Marcus. They did not rush anything. The romance that wrapped its fingers slowly around them was careful given the asymmetry in their worlds. Marcus had wealth and a life polished for public view. Anna had learned humility by necessity and was measured in trust. Their tenderness appeared in small gestures, Marcus holding her hand in a quiet, private theater, Anna teaching him a sign for something domestic and ordinary, the thumb-on-cheek motif that began in an emergency and matured into a ritualized affirmation. They rebuilt together, not as a spectacle, but as two people understanding how to hold the other's fragility. Marcus stepped back when Anna needed space and leaned in when she asked for help. And she, in turn, claimed her life with the firmness of someone who had discovered the property of her own resilience. Mrs. Blackwood continued to sit at Leonard, always choosing the table by the window. She was there when Anna signed a sentence about the final settlement, then, with the small mischief of someone who had watched a private drama unfold, pulled Anna's hand and tapped her wrist. In the laundromat of public life, the little private acts of kindness continued to be the real measure. Months later, standing on the steps of Columbia, where a small ceremony acknowledged fiscal restitution and the restoration of intellectual property rights, Anna breathed in cold air and listened as a university administrator read her name aloud. The city had obediently learned to call her what she had always been. She felt odd and exquisite, recognized. There were still things that needed healing. Trauma does not evaporate with legal victories. Anna had nightmares early on, flashes of the night her name was taken. She had days when the city's bustle felt like a threat. But the arc of recovery was real, shaped in long sessions with a counselor who specialized in white-collar survivors, in new friends whose company did not extract favors, in nights at home when Marcus would cook badly and she would tell him that his attempt at salad was an earnest failure. Those small domestic scenes, lids clinking, a thumb on cheek, a laugh that started because someone burned the risotto, became an epilogue of sorts, but not a final one. Life, as it turned out, was a series of new beginnings. And the woman from the restaurant, she who had poured the wine, one afternoon ran into Anna on the subway. Her eyes lowered. She murmured something that might have been an apology, the folds of her voice showing discomfort. Anna nodded. It was enough. Shame had been a teacher. The woman had learned it. Anna learned to accept those teachable moments without claiming the role of judge. Her life had been carved by more than retribution. It had been rebuilt with care. At the center of all of it was the small, outrageous truth of Marcus's first intervention, that someone had seen her hands and decided they mattered. The rest was work, slow, procedural, necessary. She thought of the way the city swallowed names and how sometimes one stubborn person could insist on being seen. Marcus squeezed her hand. "We'll make sure the record stays right," he said. She nodded. The future was not a single outcome, but a series of small affirmations. Anna put her fingers up to her mouth and signed a word she had taught Marcus: home. It was a small ceremony, no public declaration, no glittering finale, just two people acknowledging a shared space. As they continued down the sidewalk, the light from the storefronts brushed their faces, glass reflecting their silhouettes back at them, until the city had ceased to be an indifferent cacophony and had instead become a kind of witness. In that quiet registry, Anna felt her story settle into the world as something true and visible, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that her hands were not merely instruments of labor, but heralds of a life she had claimed back. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of Anna's life rearranged itself into a pattern she had not expected. The legal file remained on a shelf in the apartment, but it was no longer the first object she touched in the morning. Instead, mornings began with small, practical ministrations: a pot of coffee brewed precisely to Marcus's taste, a stack of newspaper clippings she glanced at but did not devour, a message or two from young women she had never met who wrote to thank her for what the visibility had made possible. The guest lecture was scheduled for a Thursday evening at a modest college auditorium. Marcus drove her there and, without the theatrics of a publicist, walked with her past a revolving door into a room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and chalk dust. Anna had rehearsed the lecture in her kitchen, had annotated the margins of her slides with notes about cadence and pause. But when she stood before the students and colleagues, she felt something steadier than nerves: the sense of doing what she had always done, translating work into meaning, making the granular visible. She spoke about ethics the way she used to speak to machines, about interfaces and affordances, about how systems favored certain hands and erased others. She told a few stories, but not the humiliating ones. Instead, she told the procedural ones, the small, unjust omissions that accumulated into real damage. She watched faces in the dim light, some skeptical, some exhaustedly familiar. And in the front row, a young woman rubbed her thumb along the cuticle of a right hand, like someone memorizing a shape. Afterwards, there were questions, conversations that followed like tributaries. A professor asked about policy. A student asked about resilience. A woman in the doorway spoke last. "My apprenticeship was all in the margins," she said, voice close. "I want to do what you did. Where do I start?" Anna gave her a pamphlet of resources she had cobbled together: names of mentors, a list of fellowship applications, contacts at the incubator Marcus had nudged her toward. The exchange was small and practical, and Anna felt the familiar thrill of alignment. A hand reached, another hand found it. The work continued. The incubator offered her an advisory role, part-time, shaped around her life rather than swallowing it. It was not an exaltation so much as a strategic platform. She could help women translate hidden labor into recognized credentials, could design the intake forms so that contribution, not spectacle, determined who got access. She imagined an audit of language, a pruning of forms that rewarded bragging over craftsmanship. There was a patch of the city, an old industrial loft turned studio, where, on Friday afternoons, she met with a handful of entrepreneurs and taught them how to write credit into the architecture of their companies. They spoke about contracts the way she used to speak about code, as a medium in which values could be encoded. Not everyone welcomed the changes. The old firm kept its polite distance and sent a representative to the signing ceremony merely to be photographed in the room. A few colleagues who had been lukewarm allies retreated. Others, embarrassed by earlier blindness, became eager in ways that smacked of opportunism. Anna navigated these encounters like someone moving through a room with delicate antiques. She acknowledged the gestures, kept the talisman file close, and measured her trust by action rather than apology. News cycles moved on, as they always did, but Anna learned how to anchor herself beyond them. She wrote an op-ed on the ethics of recognition that landed in a publication read by a surprising number of HR directors and startup founders. She took a small stipend from the college for the lecture and redirected it to a micro-grant for women who needed money for documentation, the ledger that allowed a craftsman to prove the work, the fee that paid for notarized statements. Marcus watched the transfers on his banking app and made a small joke about her becoming a philanthropist. She pressed a kiss to his forehead and promised him dinner with actual, not institutional celebration. Once, toward winter, the woman from Leonard's night that had started everything reached out. Anna had never expected contact. The message arrived as a short, formal email, an apology, carefully worded, ending with an offer to meet and to discuss amends. Anna read it at the kitchen table, with the city's late sunlight slanting across the tablecloth. Marcus was packing his briefcase for work and paused to look at her. "Do you want to see her?" he asked. Anna considered the cardboard box of documents at her feet, the napkin from that night that still lived in a drawer, and the long list of people she now needed to call for the microgrant. She thought of the woman's hand, how it had been casual and cruel in that moment, and of how small, personal remorse could not undo systems. She replied with a capacity that surprised her. Yes, she would meet, but only to listen. If the woman wanted to speak about what had happened, Anna would hear her. If she wanted to act, Anna would ask her to support the initiatives that gave private apologies public weight. The meeting was not theatrical. They met in a cafe that was quiet enough to allow for honest speech. The woman, Elena, arrived with a folder and the posture of someone practicing humility. She spoke haltingly, not about the spectacle itself, but about what brought her to that night. An upbringing of entitlement, a pattern of seeing people as props in her life's narrative. She expressed surprise at the outcome, how a single misstep had opened a fault line beneath things she had taken for granted. She asked, plainly, how she could make amends. Anna listened. The conversation did not provide closures like a legal document. It offered instead a set of possibilities. Elena paid for a year of a fellowship Anna had helped design. She volunteered at one of the microgrant review sessions. Occasionally, she attended talks and listened more than she spoke. The gestures were uneven and faltered, but they existed. Anna found herself less interested in absolution than in the accrual of real, structural changes. If the woman wanted to atone through work that repaired, then the atonement would pass through people who needed resources, not into the ritualized neatness of a public statement. At home, life continued in small domestic victories. Marcus fixed a leaky faucet without calling a plumber. Anna turned a corner shelf into a reading nook. They learned each other's silences. Marcus learned the exact inflection that meant Anna wanted to be left alone to think. And Anna learned the soft way Marcus asked questions that opened rooms in her. Their apartment hosted dinners where the conversation orbited around small labors. A neighbor who mended bicycles, a teacher who organized free weekend math clinics, a woman who made prosthetic liners in her garage. Their guests often left with a copy of the pamphlet Anna distributed, an odd emblem of how activism had folded into ordinary life. One evening, they invited a handful of the fellowship recipients over for soup and bread. The table was scarred, the best plates mismatched, the lighting humble. The women came with stories, with hands rough from labor and eyes bright with new possibilities. They talked about contracts, about the stupidity of forms that asked for confidence rather than competence, about the slow, quiet work of establishing a resume that showed craft rather than claim. Marcus poured wine, and a woman across from Anna reached out to smooth a spill with the same efficiency Anna had once done in silence. Anna watched the group. The scarred hands at the table moved as instruments and as testimonies. There were jokes and small triumphs. One woman had just received a first commission. Another had been accepted to a design residency. When it came her turn to speak, Anna said nothing long or grand. She touched the napkin in her pocket, then took it out and placed it on the table like an offering, a memory, and a marker. "This started for me with a small thing," she said. "But it's not about me. It's about making the places we work in fair enough that none of you have to keep a box of proof under your bed." They talked late into the night, the city humming beyond the window. When the last guest left, Marcus washed the dishes and Anna dried them, the house filled with the sound of domestic ritual. As she dried, she noticed the shape of her hands in the sink light, calloused in certain places, gentle in others. And she felt the impossible balance of vulnerability and power. Visibility had given her things, recognition, opportunities, an archive. But it had also given her a responsibility she had not asked for, one that required patience rather than triumph. She slid the napkin back into her bag and put the archival box on the top shelf. It was not sacred in the mythic sense. It was a ledger of reparation and a reminder of how many needed to be seen. Anna understood now that the work ahead would be uneven, that laws and policies could be coaxed but not coerced into justice. She would teach forms, redesign intake screens, lobby quietly for grant money, and keep taking small, decisive actions. On the windowsill, a single street lamp blinked against the snowless winter night. Marcus came to stand behind her and rested his hands on her shoulders. They did not need to speak. Their silence was a covenant of ordinary love. Anna placed her own hands on the sill and, for a moment, let herself simply be where she was, less a survivor of a single moment and more the steward of a life reassembled from many small, deliberate repairs. The city did not bend around them. It kept being itself, loud, indifferent, occasionally kind. But within their apartment, around that scarred table, they had invented a witness that could be relied upon. She thought of the invisible hands she had always noticed, and of the young woman in the lecture hall who had memorized a cuticle as if learning an alphabet. She felt the certainty settle like a warm cloth. Recognition mattered because it changed the ledger of a life. It was not the end of unfairness, nor did it promise a tidy peace. It was, however, a way of living that refused erasure. Anna put her fingers together and watched the pattern they made, familiar as handwriting, familiar as a map. Her hands were not merely instruments of labor. They had become the place where names grew visible and where lives were kept from vanishing. Outside, on the sidewalk that had once reflected small fortunes, a delivery van idled and a bicycle bell rang. The city kept moving.